The text arrived at 8 in the morning. "We are done with you. Do not ever find us again." It was the most foolish message my husband ever sent. His family thought those cold words would make me panic and keep funding their lies. They did not realize I treat a crumbling marriage exactly like a corporate fraud investigation. You trace the capital, seal the vulnerabilities, and patiently wait for them to orchestrate their own downfall. My name is Daisy Martin. I am 35 years of age, and I perceive reality not through sentiments, but through financial exposures. It was exactly 8:15 in the morning on a Tuesday when the text message arrived. I was sitting at my desk in my corner office on the 42nd floor of the Graybridge Biologics building in downtown Boston. The sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was a pale, unforgiving gray, mirroring the steel surface of the harbor below. My phone buzzed against the polished mahogany of my desk. A sharp, singular vibration that broke the absolute silence of my morning routine. I picked up the device. The notification on the screen displayed a message from my husband. "Carson Hale. We are done with you. Do not ever find us again." 14 words. 2 perfectly punctuated sentences. I did not drop the phone. I did not gasp, and I certainly did not cry. Instead, my eyes narrowed, and my mind immediately began to parse the data before me. The syntax was wrong. Carson did not write like that. Carson was a man of fragmented thoughts, rambling voice notes, and a flagrant disregard for proper punctuation. When he was angry, he sent paragraphs of emotionally volatile nonsense. This message was surgical. It was cold, precise, and intended to sever. This was not the voice of a frustrated husband. This was the voice of his mother, Vivian Hale. I could almost see her standing in the immaculate, debt-ridden foyer of her coastal inn, halcyon house, dictating the words while Carson stared at his shoes. It was her signature tone, a blend of aristocratic condescension and deliberate humiliation. They wanted me to shatter. They expected me to call back immediately, hysterical and pleading, begging for an explanation. They assumed that a woman discarded so abruptly would scramble to hold on to the illusion of her marriage, and more importantly, continue to pay the bills to keep that illusion afloat. They were fundamentally mistaken about who I am. I did not call. I did not ask for a reason. I opened the reply box and typed my response with steady, deliberate keystrokes. Message received. I am terminating all personal guarantees, bridge payments, and financial obligations under my name effective immediately. I hit send. Then, I placed the phone face down on the desk. To understand the catastrophic error the Hale family had just made, one must understand my profession. As the Director of Vendor Integrity at Graybridge Biologics, my entire existence is built on the architecture of rules, compliance, and exposing deception. I do not deal in feelings. I deal in supply chains, bloated invoices, hidden shell companies, and breach of contract. I spend my days hunting down microscopic anomalies in payment structures and tearing apart corporate frauds. I am the woman who finds the missing decimal point that unravels a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. I look at a contract and see exactly where the trapdoors are hidden. In short, I am a very dangerous person to betray. For the past 4 years of our marriage, I had applied a softer version of my skills to my personal life, acting as the silent, uncredited financial engine keeping the Hale family afloat. Carson fancied himself an artisanal visionary. He was the charismatic face of Harbor and Ash, a boutique pub and tasting room that was constantly on the verge of redefining the local hospitality scene, yet simultaneously always on the verge of bankruptcy. Carson despised my corporate career. He called my work dry and soul-crushing. He loved to tell his friends, over craft beers that I had implicitly paid for, that I was a woman who only understood spreadsheets, a woman entirely devoid of the big dream. He wore his tailored flannel shirts and distressed leather boots, playing the tortured creator, utterly oblivious to the fact that his dream only breathed because of my pristine credit score. Every time Harbor and Ash failed to make payroll, which happened roughly every 14 days. I was the one who quietly transferred the payroll float to keep his bartenders from walking out. I was the one who signed the personal guarantee for the imported copper distillation equipment, because the bank took one look at Carson's erratic business plan and laughed. And then there was Vivian. Halcyon House was her kingdom, a sprawling coastal inn that looked stunning in architectural magazines but hemorrhaged cash in reality. Vivian treated me like a walking, breathing automated teller machine. She invoked the sacred concept of family only when it was time to cover a catastrophic loss. "Family supports each other, Daisy dear," she would say, sipping tea on a veranda with a failing foundation. "We are building a legacy." Yet, the moment the check cleared, I was relegated back to the status of an outsider. I was the hired help, the necessary evil, the woman with no taste who merely funded the taste of others. They allowed me to sit at their dinner table, but they never truly saved me a seat. I was just the infrastructure they walked on to reach their delusions of grandeur, staring out at the Boston skyline. The pieces of the puzzle began to snap together with chilling clarity. This text message was not an emotional outburst. Vivian Hale did not do anything impulsively. A sudden, vicious excommunication like this had a distinct purpose. It was calculated to throw me off balance. They sent it this morning, a Tuesday, precisely because the banks had just opened. They wanted me paralyzed by grief while they executed whatever maneuver they had planned next. They were cutting me out, which meant they believed they no longer needed me. You do not sever the financial umbilical cord unless you believe you have found a new host, or unless you are about to extract a massive final sum and need the victim distracted. A cold, profound sense of calm washed over me, the kind of calm that precedes a perfectly planned demolition. I had always known, somewhere in the back of my mind, that this day would arrive. You cannot observe chronic financial and emotional parasitism for 4 years without mapping out an emergency exit. I turned my chair back to face my workstation. The dual monitors glowed with data sets and compliance reports, but I minimized all of them. I navigated deep into my personal encrypted drive, bypassing several layers of security protocols. There, nested in a hidden directory, was a single, heavily protected folder. I moved the cursor over the icon. The folder was simply named Exit Ledger. I double-clicked it. Rows and columns of data flooded the screen. Every bank account, every routing number, every hidden asset, every personal guarantee, every automated vendor payment, and every single cent I had ever injected into Harbor and Ash and Halcyon House over the last 4 years was documented, time-stamped, and legally categorized. It was a digital map of the Hale family's absolute dependency on me. Inside the exit ledger, I had subfolders meticulously organized. One was entirely dedicated to the imported copper distillation equipment. I had the original lease agreements scanned and saved, documents which clearly stated that the expensive machinery belonged to my limited liability company, not Carson personally. I had the utility bills for Halcyon House, the property tax receipts that Vivian had cried over until I wrote the check, and the vendor contracts for the high-end linens she insisted on using to impress her guests. I had spent my entire adult life learning how to dismantle corrupt organizations. Now, I was going to dismantle my marriage using the exact same methodology. The Hale family had operated on the assumption that my silence was a sign of submission. They mistook my willingness to pay as a lack of boundaries. They did not understand that I was simply gathering data. Every invoice I paid, every crisis I averted, was a piece of leverage I quietly stored away in this digital vault. I looked at the clock on my computer screen. It was 8:30 in the morning. The business day was just beginning. By noon, their entire financial ecosystem would be starved of oxygen. By tomorrow, it would begin to collapse in on itself under the weight of its own debt. They told me never to find them again. It was a completely unnecessary demand. I had no intention of looking for them. I was just going to pull the rug out from under their feet and wait for gravity to do its job. The first strike had to sever the largest structural beam. I opened the commercial leasing portal for the industrial equipment provider. My fingers moved across the keyboard with the sterile, unforgiving precision of a surgeon operating on a tumor. I navigated to the active contracts dashboard. There it was, the massive lease agreement for the imported copper distillation units that sat like a crown jewel in the center of the tasting room. Carson loved to stroke the polished metal and talk endlessly about his artisan craft to anyone who would listen. He conveniently ignored the fact that my signature on the guarantor line was the only thing preventing a repossession team from hauling them away. I clicked the commercial guarantor tab, selected the revocation option, and typed my full legal name to confirm the immediate withdrawal of my financial backing. The system processed the request for an agonizing 3 seconds before a stark green confirmation banner appeared on the screen. The vendor's automated system would immediately flag the account for insufficient collateral. By noon today, Carson would receive a system-generated email demanding a substitute guarantor or a full cash payoff. He possessed neither. Next was the blood supply. I switched browser tabs to my primary banking dashboard. For nearly 40 months, I had maintained a silent, automated safety net to prevent his grand vision from collapsing. Every second and fourth Thursday, a scheduled transfer swept just enough capital from my corporate salary into his business operating account to cover the wages of his bartenders, his prep cooks, and his floor managers. I located the recurring rule in the system settings. I did not hesitate. I clicked the red deletion icon. The scheduled transfer of $12,500 vanished from the pending queue without a trace. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow was payday. When Carson attempted to run the payroll software, the bank would return a fatal error code for insufficient funds. I turned my attention away from the city and focused on the coast. I logged into the various merchant portals connected to Halcyon House. Vivian prided herself on her exquisite, flawless taste, a taste she believed she manifested through sheer aristocratic willpower rather than my checking account. I pulled up the billing profile for the boutique linen service that laundered the 1,000 thread count sheets her guests slept on. I deleted my stored credit card information. I moved to the artisan liquor distributor that supplied the rare scotches Carson liked to pour for high-rolling investors. I hit the account suspension button. Finally, I accessed the back end of the premium reservation software. The ridiculously expensive booking engine Vivian bragged about to her country club friends as a sign of her technological savvy. I canceled the monthly auto renewal. Without my payment method, her entire online calendar and booking capability would vanish into thin air by midnight on Sunday. The offensive maneuvers were set in motion. Now, I needed to build an impenetrable wall. I opened a new browser window and systematically accessed the security portals for the 3 major credit reporting agencies. I initiated a total security freeze on my social security number. I updated my contact preferences across all financial platforms, demanding multi-factor authentication and a direct, verbal phone confirmation for any inquiry, loan application, or line of credit attempted under my identity. I changed the master passwords to my email accounts, my cloud storage, and my investment portfolios, generating 20-character alphanumeric strings that I locked away in an offline manager. Before closing my laptop, I opened the state corporate registry database. I needed to review the legal filings to ensure the trap was perfectly aligned. I pulled up the active status for Martin Harbor Holdings, the limited liability company I had formed strictly for liability protection 3 years ago. Carson loved to give tours of his establishment, sweeping his arms grandly to encompass the custom mahogany bar, the commercial-grade kitchen upgrades, the intricate ambient lighting system, and the heavy oak tables. He called it his empire. He never bothered to read the operating agreements his lawyer handed him. Every single one of those expensive build-outs, every piece of custom woodwork, was the exclusive property of Martin Harbor Holdings. He did not own the fixtures. He merely occupied the space my company owned. When the time came, I would not be destroying his property. I would simply be executing a legal reclamation of mine. I left the gray glass tower of my office at precisely 10:30 in the morning. I drove my sedan to the four-bedroom colonial we shared in the affluent suburbs. The paved driveway was completely empty. The house was dead silent, smelling faintly of the expensive cedar wood and sage candles Vivian gifted us every Christmas. I walked upstairs to the master suite. I did not open the walk-in closet holding the silk blouses or the designer evening gowns Carson liked me to wear when he needed to show me off to potential business partners. I had no use for those costumes anymore. I walked straight to the heavy fireproof safe bolted to the floor of the guest bedroom closet. I spun the dial, entered the combination, and pulled the heavy door open. I retrieved my passport, 7 years of certified tax returns, the original master copies of the lease agreements, and the heavy gold pocket watch that had belonged to my grandmother. I placed them carefully into a sleek leather briefcase alongside a solid state backup drive containing a mirror image of my digital ledgers. That briefcase held my actual life. The rest of the house was just set dressing. I walked back downstairs, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors. As I passed through the custom kitchen, a flash of gold foil on the massive marble island caught my eye. It was a piece of heavy, cream-colored cardstock, standing perfectly upright against a vase of fresh hydrangeas. I picked it up. It was an invitation to the Winter Lantern Gala, an annual high society charity event. The embossed text announced it was hosted by the Hale family, celebrating a bold new era for Halcyon House and its visionary ventures. The date of the formal event was set for exactly 2 weeks from Saturday. I stared at the elegant calligraphy, tracing the raised letters with my thumb. Suddenly, the brutal morning text message made perfect. Chilling strategic sense. Vivian did not want a messy, protracted separation dragging out through the social season. She needed me surgically removed right now. She wanted the stage completely cleared. The gala was meant to be their triumphant public relaunch. A night to court new, wealthier investors and bask in the spotlight of local high society without any awkward questions. They could not execute that performance with a quiet, spreadsheet-obsessed wife hovering in the background. A walking, breathing reminder of their utter financial incompetence. They were kicking me out today to clear the runway for their grand public victory lap. I set the thick invitation back down on the marble counter, placing it exactly where I found it. I looked around the pristine kitchen one last time. A lesser woman might have taken a heavy iron skillet to the stainless steel appliances. A deeply hurt woman might have smashed the crystal wine glasses against the wall or screamed until her throat bled. I felt absolutely no such urge. Anger is loud, messy, and ultimately useless. Vengeance, true vengeance, is a silent, calculating machine. I walked out the front door and locked the deadbolt behind me. I did not make a sound. I did not leave a note. And I did not slam the door. I walked to my car in total silence, because I knew the undeniable truth of the situation. When their entire world finally shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces, it would not be because I threw a stone. It would be because the hollow floor they built out of lies could no longer hold their own weight. The dashboard screen of my sedan flashed with a high-priority notification just as I was merging onto the interstate, leaving the affluent suburbs behind. It was not a text message or a social media update. It was a severe, red-flagged alert from the enterprise-grade identity monitoring system I maintained through my corporate executive benefits. I immediately guided my vehicle onto the shoulder, shifted the transmission into park, and opened the secure application. A digital inquiry had just been successfully logged against my primary credit file. Less than 30 seconds later, a second notification arrived. This one was a direct, automated email from the Commercial Underwriting Division of Blue Ridge Merchant Capital. The subject line was sterile and terrifying. Confirmation of receipt expedited commercial capital request. I tapped the screen, my eyes rapidly scanning the formatted text. It was an application for an emergency business bridge loan. The principal amount requested was $180,000. The primary borrower listed was Carson Hale, the sole guarantor. The entity bearing the absolute entirety of the legal and financial risk was listed as Daisy Martin. My pulse remained steady. I did not panic. My mind simply transitioned into forensic mode. I scrolled down to the attached digital dossier. They had submitted a comprehensive financial package to ensure immediate approval and rapid disbursement. I opened the encrypted file and stared at my own highly confidential documents. There was my most recent W-2 form, my complete federal tax identification number, a fabricated verification of employment letter falsely bearing a Graybridge Biologics Human Resources watermark, and a digital signature certificate. The signature, executed via a popular electronic document platform, was a flawless replication of my cursive script. They had not merely filed a desperate application, they had committed federal identity theft and wire fraud. Before I could fully process the audacity of the forged signature, my phone vibrated in my hand with an incoming call. The caller identification displayed a toll-free corporate number. I answered it, my voice perfectly neutral. "This is Daisy Martin." "Good morning, Miss Martin." A pleasant, slightly nasal voice responded. "This is Gregory from the Commercial Claims Division at Atlantic Standard Insurance. I am calling to verify the preliminary details on the loss notice filed approximately 15 minutes ago for the Harbor and Ash property." I kept my breathing perfectly even. "A loss notice." "Yes, ma'am. We received a priority claim regarding a catastrophic burst pipe incident in the primary storage facility. The initial estimate for water damage and inventory loss is substantial. Because you are listed as the primary policyholder for the fixtures and the limited liability company, our protocols require a verbal confirmation before we dispatch an emergency field adjuster to authorize the cleanup funds." The architecture of their strike was suddenly laid bare, illuminated in stark, undeniable clarity. This was a highly coordinated, dual-front financial assault. "Gregory," I said, my tone dropping a full octave, adopting the absolute authority I utilized in vendor compliance hearings. "Do not dispatch an adjuster. Do not authorize a single cent of cleanup funds. I am officially flagging that claim as fraudulent. There is no burst pipe. I want the file locked and immediately transferred to your Special Investigations Unit. I will be submitting a formal affidavit of forgery before the close of business today." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by the frantic clicking of a keyboard. "Understood, Miss Martin. I am locking the claim immediately." I disconnected the call and immediately dialed the direct, unlisted number for the corporate fraud department at Blue Ridge Merchant Capital. I bypassed the automated system with a secure PIN. When a senior analyst answered, I did not waste time explaining my marital situation. I spoke purely in the language of risk mitigation and liability. "My name is Daisy Martin. I am the purported guarantor on an expedited loan application filed less than an hour ago for $180,000. The primary applicant is Carson Hale. The application contains forged signatures, stolen tax documents, and fabricated employment verification. I am initiating a hard freeze on the application. I demand it be routed to your internal fraud division immediately, and I expect a full digital footprint report on the upload origin." The analyst verified my identity through a series of complex security questions. Within 4 minutes, the loan application was paralyzed, dead in the digital water before a single underwriter could even review it. I ended the call, activated my phone's secure mobile hotspot, and connected my encrypted laptop right there in the driver's seat. I needed to see exactly how sloppy they had been. I downloaded the complete document package they had submitted to Blue Ridge, bypassing the standard document viewer to drag the files directly into a forensic analysis tool I used for corporate supply chain audits. I started with the contractor invoices attached to the loan application, ostensibly meant to justify the emergency need for capital. They were invoices from a local commercial plumbing and restoration company. I ran an optical character recognition scan and compared the font kerning. The numbers had been clumsily altered. A $5,000 quote had been manipulated to read $50,000. Next, I extracted the hidden metadata from the photographs included as proof of the supposed water damage. Digital photographs contain invisible EXIF data, logging the exact time, date, and sometimes the GPS coordinates of when the image was captured. I pulled the data string. The photographs were not taken this morning. The timestamps indicated they were captured 14 months ago, during a minor leak that I had already paid to repair out of my own pocket. Finally, I analyzed the digital tracking certificate attached to the forged electronic signature. Every digital document logs the Internet Protocol address of the machine that executed it. I cross-referenced the IP address in the document against a secure database. It resolved to a static residential network provider. It did not trace back to Carson's phone or the public wireless network at Harbor and Ash. It mapped directly to the dedicated private network at Halcyon House. I closed the laptop screen. The pieces locked together into a terrifyingly lucid picture. The text message I received at 8:15 in the morning was never about ending a relationship. It was a tactical diversion. It was the digital equivalent of throwing a flashbang grenade into a room before a heist. They calculated that sending a brutally cold, terminating message would plunge me into a state of hysterical shock. They expected me to be crying in the executive washroom, calling my friends, or driving aimlessly in a state of emotional devastation. They needed me completely blinded and paralyzed for a window of roughly 4 hours. That 4-hour window was all the time they needed to push the fraudulent loan and the fake insurance claim through the automated approval systems. By the time I recovered enough to check my finances, the $180,000 and the insurance payout would have been safely routed into an offshore or heavily shielded account. I leaned back against the leather headrest, staring at the highway traffic rushing past. Carson was not capable of orchestrating this. Carson was a man who could barely remember to order fresh limes for his bar. He lacked the discipline, the technical knowledge, and the sheer malice required to execute a coordinated financial crime of this magnitude. This had Vivian's fingerprints all over it. Her ruthless pragmatism, her utter disregard for anyone outside her bloodline. But even Vivian needed an architect. She needed someone who understood the loopholes in commercial lending and insurance liability. She needed Reed Colton. Reed Colton was the Hale family attorney, a man who specialized in aggressive wealth protection and making inconvenient problems disappear for the local elite. He was slick, arrogant, and entirely devoid of ethical boundaries. I could picture the three of them sitting in the private study at Halcyon House late last night, drinking expensive scotch, drafting the forged documents, and planning the exact minute to send the text message. A distinct, 4-step strategic roadmap materialized in my mind. Step 1: amputate Daisy with a sudden, vicious emotional strike to ensure compliance through shock. Step 2: extract maximum capital through rapid, fraudulent applications while she is incapacitated. Step 3: launch a preemptive public relations smear campaign to brand her as an unstable, vindictive corporate shark who abandoned her family. Step 4: take the stage at the Winter Lantern Gala, playing the role of the brave, resilient family that survived a toxic marriage. Flush with newly stolen cash, I sat in the silence of my car, waiting for the profound grief of a shattered marriage to hit me. I waited for the tears, for the agonizing heartbreak of realizing the man I loved had betrayed me. But the grief never came. Instead, a cold, dark void opened in my chest. The most profound shock of the morning was not that my husband had fallen out of love with me. It was the terrifying, undeniable realization that he had never actually been in love with me at all. I scrolled through 4 years of memories, reevaluating every anniversary, every quiet dinner, every time he said he loved me. They were all transactional. He never looked at me and saw a wife, a partner, or a confidant. From the very first day we met, Carson Hale and his family had looked at me and seen nothing more than a breathing financial structure. I was a source of funding. I was a balance sheet with a heartbeat. I put the car back into drive. They wanted to play a game of corporate warfare masked as a marital dispute. They wanted to steal my capital and burn my reputation to the ground to light their gala. I pulled back onto the interstate and headed toward the city. I was not going to cry over a man who never existed. I was going to systematically dismantle a criminal enterprise, and I was going to make sure Reed Colton went down with them. The drive up the coastal highway took exactly 45 minutes. The late afternoon wind howled off the Atlantic, whipping freezing salt spray against the windshield of my car. It was nearly 5 o'clock, and the sky was already bruising into a deep, stormy violet. I pulled through the wrought iron gates of Halcyon House. The property sat on a cliff overlooking the gray churning water, a sprawling Victorian estate that looked like a postcard of New England wealth. From the outside, it projected absolute stability. Inside, it was a hollowed-out monument to Vivian's ego, entirely propped up by the financial architecture I had constructed. I parked my car near the service entrance, out of sight from the main sweeping driveway. I did not come here to cause a scene or demand answers. I came to observe the ecosystem of their arrogance. I wanted to look them in the eye and see exactly what they thought they had achieved. I used my key to unlock the heavy side door, stepping into the mudroom. The air inside smelled of expensive cedar wood smoke, roasted winter vegetables, and the distinct, crisp scent of imported champagne. I walked silently down the carpeted hallway toward the main parlor. The heavy double doors were slightly ajar, allowing the sounds of a premature victory to spill out into the corridor. Laughter echoed against the high coffered ceilings. It was not the tense, relieved laughter of people who had just barely escaped a crisis. It was the smug, full-throated laughter of predators who believed they had successfully consumed their prey. I positioned myself in the shadows of the hallway, perfectly out of their line of sight, and peered through the opening. The parlor was bathed in the warm, golden glow of a roaring fire. Vivian stood by the mantelpiece, holding a crystal flute. She wore a tailored wool dress, her posture rigidly aristocratic. Carson stood in the center of the Persian rug, his cheeks flushed with alcohol and unearned triumph. Lounging in one of the leather armchairs was Reed Colton, his tailored suit jacket unbuttoned, looking every bit the architect of a successful heist. "To the future," Carson announced, raising his glass high. "A future where we are finally untethered. No more being dragged down by a woman who measures passion in profit margins. I am finally free of the warden. No more spreadsheets. No more audits every time I want to expand my own vision." "Here, here," Vivian chimed in, taking a delicate sip of her drink. She offered a cold, dismissive smile. "I always told you she was a terrible fit for this family. Carson, the girl had capital, yes, but absolutely no pedigree, no sense of culture. She looked at this magnificent property and saw a depreciation schedule. She simply lacked the spirit to understand the art of hospitality and our brand vision. You cannot buy class, and she certainly proved that." Reed Colton chuckled, swirling the golden liquid in his glass. "Well, you will not have to worry about her lack of vision any longer. The new capital disbursement is scheduled to hit the main accounts by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Once that wire clears, we solidify the expansion, and we hold all the leverage. If she tries to drag out the divorce, we bleed her in court. But frankly, with the documents we filed today, she is entirely obsolete." They were celebrating the arrival of ghost money. They were drinking to a financial rescue that I had already slaughtered hours ago. It took every ounce of my professional discipline not to laugh out loud in the empty hallway. My eyes drifted away from the central trio and landed on a woman standing near the bar cart. It was Laurel Pike, the boutique event designer hired to orchestrate the upcoming gala. She was younger than me, dressed in an effortlessly chic silk blouse, her dark hair perfectly tousled. As Carson lowered his glass, his eyes met hers across the room. It was not a professional glance. It was a heavy, saturated look of profound intimacy. Laurel offered a slow, knowing smile and discreetly brushed her fingers against the edge of the mahogany table. A gesture Carson immediately mirrored. The final piece of the puzzle slid into place, smooth and cold. The urgency of my removal was not just financial. Carson had already installed my replacement. He wanted the new loan, the newly renovated pub, and the shiny new woman, all neatly arranged before the charity gala. I shifted my gaze to the far corner of the room. Tessa Hale, Carson's younger sister, sat at a small antique writing desk. She was supposed to be the operational manager of the inn, but she looked entirely out of place in the celebratory atmosphere. A stack of thick leather-bound ledgers sat in front of her. She was not drinking. She looked pale, her shoulders hunched, her eyes darting nervously between her mother, Reed, and the paperwork. She looked like a hostage who knew exactly how the bomb was wired. She knew something deeply problematic was buried in those books, something far worse than standard insolvency. I decided I had seen enough of the performance. I pushed the heavy oak doors fully open and stepped into the light of the parlor. The laughter died instantly. The silence that crashed over the room was absolute and suffocating. Carson froze, his champagne flute halfway to his mouth. Vivian's aristocratic posture stiffened into sheer porcelain panic. Reed Colton dropped his feet from the coffee table, suddenly looking very much like a lawyer who had just been caught committing a felony. Laurel took a swift, highly revealing step backward, putting distance between herself and my husband. I did not acknowledge any of them. I did not scream. I did not throw accusations about the forged loan or the affair I had just witnessed. I simply walked past them, my heels clicking methodically against the hardwood floor. "What are you doing here?" Carson finally managed to ask, his voice cracking slightly, betraying the bravado he had possessed just 30 seconds earlier. I ignored him. I walked straight out the opposite set of doors and ascended the grand staircase to the suite we had sometimes used during busy holiday weekends. The room was untouched. My expensive evening gown still hung in the cedar closet. My vanity still held the high-end perfumes Vivian had insisted I wear to project the right image. I bypassed all of it. I went directly to the locked filing cabinet in the corner of the sitting room. I used my master key, opened the bottom drawer, and extracted the original hard copies of the historical donor agreements for the property, along with the foundational legal binders for the estate. These were the documents that proved exactly who owned what before their fraudulent remodeling began. I slid the heavy folders into my leather briefcase. I left the dresses. I left the jewelry. I left the entire illusion behind. When I reached the bottom of the staircase, Carson was standing in the foyer, blocking the heavy front door. His initial shock had worn off, replaced by a defensive, aggressive arrogance. He crossed his arms over his chest. "You think you can just walk in here and intimidate us?" he sneered, puffing his chest out to appear larger. "You are done, Daisy. After the gala next week, I am taking Harbor and Ash to the next level. I will have the reputation. I will have the capital. And I will have a life that does not involve asking your permission. You are walking out of here with nothing but a briefcase." I stopped 3 feet away from him. I looked at the man I had slept next to for 4 years. The man who had secretly drained my accounts, forged my signature, and planned to replace me before the ink was even dry on the fraudulent applications. He thought he had won. He truly believed he was the master of his own fate. I adjusted the strap of my briefcase on my shoulder. I looked him dead in the eyes, my voice barely above a whisper, yet sharp enough to cut through the heavy oak door behind him. "Enjoy this evening, Carson," I said smoothly. "Enjoy the champagne. Enjoy the fire. Enjoy it very, very carefully." I did not wait for a response. I stepped around him, pulled the heavy door open, and walked out into the freezing wind. As I drove away from the towering estate, the image of them standing in that parlor burned in my mind. They were throwing a victory party on the deck of a sinking ship, completely unaware that I had already locked all the lifeboats and opened the bottom valves. By 9 o'clock on Friday morning, the mechanical reality of my actions began to manifest in the physical world. I sat at my desk at Graybridge Biologics, watching the automated alerts populate my secondary monitor. The dominoes were falling with spectacular efficiency. A digital notification confirmed that a third-party repossession team had taped a bright yellow legal notice to the front door of the tasting room, demanding immediate surrender of the imported copper distillation units. 10 minutes later, a local artisan bakery and a premium meat purveyor both logged delivery suspensions due to invalid payment methods. Meanwhile, the administrative dashboard for the boutique inn showed a glaring red banner indicating that all incoming reservation funds were placed on an indefinite security hold. My private cell phone began to vibrate violently across the polished wood of my desk. The caller identification flashed with Vivian's name. I let it ring. It stopped, then immediately started again. On the fourth consecutive attempt, I pressed the green acceptance icon and placed the device on speakerphone. "You vindictive, ungrateful creature!" Vivian shrieked. The aristocratic veneer was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, unhinged panic of a woman watching her kingdom dissolve. "Do you have any idea what you are doing? You are destroying a family business. You are dismantling a community institution because you are too bitter to accept that my son outgrew you. Turn the accounts back on immediately, or I swear to you, I will make sure you never show your face in this state again." I reached forward and tapped the red icon, severing the connection without uttering a single syllable. I had a schedule to keep. At exactly noon, I walked into the private dining atrium of an exclusive corporate club in downtown Boston. Graybridge Biologics was hosting a high-level executive and donor luncheon to discuss upcoming philanthropic healthcare initiatives. The room was a masterclass in understated wealth. Crystal water glasses caught the muted light from the chandeliers. Men in bespoke wool suits and women in structured cashmere dresses spoke in hushed, polite tones over plates of seared scallops and microgreens. This was my professional arena. It was an environment governed by logic, reputation, and verifiable capital. I was seated near the center of the room, conversing quietly with a senior vice president of regional hospital logistics. When the heavy oak doors at the entrance violently swung open, the low hum of sophisticated conversation instantly died. I turned my head. Vivian, Carson, and Reed Colton stood in the entryway, shoving past the protests of a frantic hostess. They looked entirely out of place. Carson was red in the face, breathing heavily. Vivian's hair was slightly windblown, her designer coat hastily buttoned. Reed looked tense, scanning the room like a cornered animal trying to assess the threat level. They spotted me and marched directly across the dining room floor. The wealthy attendees turned in their chairs, their expressions shifting from mild annoyance to captivated shock. Vivian did not lower her voice. She wanted an audience. She wanted to leverage the public space to force my submission. "There she is," Vivian announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "The woman who uses her corporate salary to financially abuse an elderly woman and crush a brilliant creative enterprise. You think you can just freeze our bank accounts? You think you can starve us out because you are a cold, unfeeling spreadsheet of a human being." Carson stepped forward, adopting a posture of righteous indignation. "You are trying to ruin my life, Daisy. You cut the payroll for my staff. You canceled the vendor orders for the weekend. You are throwing a tantrum and hurting innocent employees just to get back at me." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water, placed the glass gently onto the linen tablecloth, and stood up. I smoothed the front of my tailored charcoal blazer. "I apologize for the interruption. Ladies and gentlemen," I addressed the surrounding tables, my tone perfectly calm and professionally modulated. "May I ask for just 2 minutes of your patience to resolve this administrative error?" I reached down and unzipped my sleek leather portfolio resting on the empty chair beside me. I extracted a perfectly organized stack of documents printed on heavy legal stock. I turned back to my estranged family. "Vivian," I said, projecting my voice just enough to ensure the surrounding donors could hear every crisp consonant. "You are accusing me of financial abuse. However, I am simply restructuring my own portfolio. I am holding the formal termination letters for the commercial guarantees I graciously provided for the past 48 months. As you are aware, those accounts were funded entirely by my personal corporate income. I fanned the documents out on the table. Furthermore, I continued, turning my gaze to Carson, I did not cut your payroll. I simply stopped donating my own salary to a failing business model. And regarding the equipment you claim I'm trying to steal from you, I believe you forgot to read the operating agreements you signed 3 years ago. The custom bar, the kitchen upgrades, and the copper stills do not belong to you. They belong to Martin Harbor Holdings, a limited liability company of which I am the sole proprietor. I cannot steal what I already own. A collective, barely audible gasp rippled through the nearest tables. I recognized several of the faces watching the scene unfold. They were prominent local philanthropists, the exact same people Vivian relentlessly courted at country club mixers, boasting about her legacy, her vast estate, and her son's thriving hospitality empire. I watched the realization dawn on their faces. The illusion was shattered right in front of them. The wealthy matriarch of Halcyon House was nothing more than a dependent living on the credit rating of her daughter-in-law. Reed Colton recognized the catastrophic shift in power. He stepped aggressively into my personal space, attempting to use his physical presence and legal authority to intimidate me into silence. Miss Martin, this is highly inappropriate, Reed hissed, his voice dropping into a menacing register. You are engaging in tortious interference and public defamation. If you do not cease this behavior immediately, I will have an injunction filed against you by the end of the business day, and we will sue you for every dollar of lost revenue. I looked at the attorney with an expression of absolute, chilling pity. Mr. Colton, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, yet remaining crystalline in the quiet room. I strongly advise you to choose your next words with extreme caution. Before you threaten me with civil litigation, you might want to call the Commercial Underwriting Division at Blue Ridge Merchant Capital. A business loan application for $180,000 was submitted yesterday morning. It contained a fabricated verification of employment and my forged electronic signature. The fraud division has already locked the file and traced the Internet Protocol address directly to the private network at Halcyon House. The blood instantly drained from Reed's face. His jaw went slack. The aggressive posture dissolved into pure, paralyzing terror. He knew exactly what a federal wire fraud charge could do to his life. Now, I said, stepping back and gesturing toward the entrance, unless you would like to discuss the intricacies of digital forensics in front of these distinguished guests, I suggest you leave my professional event immediately. 2 large security guards in dark suits had already materialized behind the trio. They did not need to use force. The utter humiliation had broken Vivian's spirit. She looked around the room, making eye contact with a wealthy donor she had golfed with the previous summer. The donor simply looked away, taking a sip of his wine. Carson stared at the floor, his face burning with shame. The guards quietly escorted them toward the exit. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them. The dining room remained silent for a few seconds before the low hum of conversation resumed, this time infused with a frantic, electrified energy. Everyone was whispering. As I sat back down and placed my napkin on my lap, I noticed a woman sitting 3 tables away. She was a prominent lifestyle and society columnist for a major Boston publication. Her eyes were wide, and her thumbs were flying across the screen of her mobile phone with predatory speed. I picked up my fork and looked out the window at the city below. The legal and financial phase of the conflict was officially over. I had exposed their insolvency and neutralized their ability to steal from me. But as I watched the columnist type, I understood the dark reality of what was coming next. Vivian and Carson had just been stripped of their pride in front of the exact audience they desperately needed to impress. They could no longer fight me with paperwork or lawyers. They were backed into a corner, completely desperate and highly dangerous. I knew, with absolute certainty, that they would now transition to a war of public emotion, attempting to drag my name through the mud to save their own. I returned to my apartment in the city as the sun dipped below the skyline. casting long, fractured shadows across the hardwood floors. The quiet was absolute. I opened my encrypted laptop, but I did not look at my own corporate accounts. I needed to look directly into the structural rot of theirs. 18 months ago, Tessa had come to me in tears because a sudden power surge had wiped her local hard drive. To prevent a catastrophic loss of data, I had quietly set up a mirrored, automated cloud backup for the Halcyon House bookkeeping system, securely tying the administrative recovery credentials to my own master server. Vivian, Carson, and Reed Colton were entirely too arrogant and technologically illiterate to understand how cloud syncing worked, let alone how to disable it. I entered the complex alphanumeric recovery sequence, the loading bar filled with agonizing slowness, and then the raw, unfiltered, financial soul of Halcyon House lay bare on my screen. I bypassed the main operating accounts immediately, already knowing they were a catastrophic mess of red ink and unpaid vendor invoices. Instead, my cursor hovered over a segregated, restricted account label, the Harbor Memorial Scholarship. This was the sacred cow of Vivian's public persona. Local affluent families donated heavily to this specific trust, deeply believing the funds were strictly allocated to provide college tuition assistance for the children of the local commercial fishing fleet. It was a noble, highly publicized initiative that gave the Hale family an unearned aura of philanthropic grace. I opened the transaction ledger for the past 2 years. Pulling the raw data into a pivot table, the blood in my veins turned to ice. The money had not gone to a single student. Instead, I found a steady parasitic drain. Month after month, massive outbound transfers were masked under vague internal accounting codes. I cross-referenced the dates with the depleted operating accounts. The charity money was being systematically used to cover massive operational shortfalls. It paid the state lodging taxes that Vivian chronically ignored until the final notices arrived. It subsidized the inflated payroll when my own secret transfers fell short. Most sickening of all, I found a cluster of debit transactions directly linked to Carson's corporate card, matching the exact dates he purchased cases of extremely rare, imported scotch for his private tasting reserve. They were literally drinking the college funds of dead fishermen's children. The rot went even deeper. I filtered the payee list and found a recurring vendor categorized under Floral Concept Consulting. The disbursements were massive, far exceeding any reasonable budget for weekly lobby arrangements or event centerpieces. I ran the tax identification number attached to the vendor profile through a public state registry. It belonged to a single-member limited liability company registered directly to Laurel Pike. The payment dates perfectly aligned with Carson's supposed out-of-state business trips to source new brewery equipment. He was not just sleeping with the event designer. He was financing his affair using stolen charity money, funneling it right under his mother's nose, or perhaps with her tacit approval. To execute this level of embezzlement without triggering an automatic audit by the State Charity Commission, they needed an ironclad paper trail. I accessed the Board of Directors directory within the administrative files. I found the meeting minutes for the Scholarship Oversight Committee. A quick metadata scrub on the digital files revealed the truth. The documents had not been created on the dates listed in the official headers. They had all been generated in a single, frantic 3-hour window just 2 weeks ago, authored by a user profile registered to Reed Colton. The attorney had sat at his mahogany desk and completely rewritten history, backdating resolutions and manufacturing fake board approvals to legally justify the illegal withdrawals. I leaned back in my chair, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. They were not merely incompetent, arrogant business owners anymore. They were organized felons. They were stealing from the dead to finance their delusions of grandeur. The silence of my apartment was abruptly broken by the sharp buzz of my phone at 11:15 in the evening. It was an encrypted text message from Tessa. "Daisy, please, if someone moves money from the Memorial Trust to the operating account, is that a federal crime? I'm so scared." I did not text back. I typed an address for a 24-hour diner sitting on the county line, halfway between my city apartment and the coast. and told her to be there in exactly 1 hour. I arrived first, taking a booth in the far back corner beneath a flickering fluorescent light. The air smelled of stale coffee, industrial cleaner, and fried potatoes, a stark, gritty contrast to the hollow luxury of her mother's world. Tessa walked in 20 minutes later. She looked completely broken. She wore a heavy gray sweater, her eyes red and swollen, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if she expected Reed Colton to emerge from the shadows of the parking lot. She slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from me, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold the thick ceramic coffee mug the tired waitress dropped off. "I did not know the whole picture," Tessa whispered, her voice cracking as she stared into her black coffee. "I swear to you, Daisy, Reed would just hand me a stack of receipts and tell me to edit the expense descriptions in the ledger. He said it was standard tax reallocation. He told me it was a temporary bridge loan from the charity and that we would pay it back in full immediately after the gala. But the hole just kept getting deeper. I saw the massive floral invoices. I asked Carson about them, and he screamed at me to mind my own business and just type the numbers. "You altered financial records for a registered nonprofit entity," I stated evenly, offering absolutely no emotional comfort. "Ignorance of the broader conspiracy does not grant you immunity. Tessa, you are the sole bookkeeper on record. Your digital signature is on every fraudulent transfer." Tessa buried her face in her hands, a ragged, desperate sob escaping her throat. I know it is over, but it is worse than you think. You saw the emergency loan application they filed yesterday morning." I nodded slowly, letting her speak. "Carson was never going to put that money into the pub," she confessed, looking up at me with terrified, tear-filled eyes. "He was going to use the fraudulent loan to put a massive cash down payment on a luxury condo down in Charleston. He and Laurel were planning to sign the closing papers the Monday morning after the gala. He was going to take the money, disappear, let the inn finally collapse, and leave my mother and me holding the entire crushing weight of the debt." The sheer, breathtaking cowardice of the plan settled over me. Carson was willing to destroy his wife, bankrupt his own mother, and leave his younger sister facing federal prison, all to fund a sunny coastal escape with his mistress. Tessa reached across the sticky table, desperately trying to grab my hand, but I pulled it back smoothly, resting it flat on the surface. "Daisy, what do I do?" she pleaded, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "Reed has all the original files locked in his office. If the state investigates, he will pin the embezzlement entirely on me. He is the brilliant lawyer. I am just the naive girl who typed the numbers into the machine. No one will believe I did not know." I looked at the terrified young woman across from me. I felt a fleeting, microscopic spark of pity, but I quickly extinguished it. Pity was a dangerous luxury for people who were not currently standing in the blast radius of a financial bomb. "I cannot protect you, Tessa," I said, my voice steady, analytical, and devoid of warmth. "I am not your lawyer, and I am certainly not your family anymore. A massive federal and state investigation is coming, and it will level Halcyon House to the ground. When the authorities arrive with boxes to seize the hard drives, they will not care about your tears or your intentions. They will only care about the paper trail." I slid a $20 bill onto the table to cover the coffees and stood up, looking down at her trembling frame. "The only advice I will give you is this," I said quietly, ensuring every word landed with maximum impact. "When the floor collapses, the people who survive are the ones who do not try to catch the falling debris. The first person to hand over the absolute truth is the only one who gets to walk out of the wreckage with a shred of dignity. Choose your side very carefully before the gala begins." I turned and walked out of the diner into the freezing night, the bell on the glass door chiming behind me, leaving her alone with the agonizing weight of her own complicity. The digital assault began exactly 48 hours later. By Monday morning, the physical financial blockades I had constructed forced them into the only arena they had left, stripped of their capital leverage. Vivian and Carson weaponized the public narrative. It was a predictable, desperate pivot, relying entirely on the assumption that I cared about local social optics. The opening strike arrived at 8 in the morning via a mass email blast sent from the official Harbor Memorial Scholarship address list. I received a copy because my corporate email address was still registered as a top-tier donor. The subject line read, "Preserving our legacy against malicious interference." Vivian had drafted a masterpiece of manipulative fiction. She made zero mention of the frozen bank accounts, the forged loan documents, or the repossessed distillation equipment. Instead, she painted a tragic, bleeding heart portrait of a beloved local family business under siege by a bitter, controlling executive. She accused me of actively attempting to destroy a community institution simply because I could not handle the natural dissolution of a marriage outgrown by my own emotional limitations. She used highly calculated words like cruel, vindictive, and financially abusive. Within an hour, she had cross-posted a slightly more hysterical version of the letter to her personal social media profiles, making sure to tag every prominent business owner and local politician in her extensive network. Carson, never one to let his mother control the entire spotlight, took a different approach. He uploaded a highly produced, agonizingly earnest video to his professional pages. He sat on a rustic wooden stool in the dimly lit, now silent tasting room of Harbor and Ash. He wore a simple, unbuttoned flannel shirt. Looking disheveled and profoundly wounded, he spoke directly into the camera lens, his voice thick with rehearsed emotion. He claimed he had spent 4 years suffocating under the weight of a woman who viewed human connection as a spreadsheet. He told his thousands of followers that his grandly creative vision for the community was being held hostage by a cold corporate director who wanted to crush his dreams simply out of spite. The local community, perpetually hungry for scandal and fiercely protective of their established wealthy families, devoured the narrative. The comment sections overflowed with outrage directed entirely at me. People I had never met were drafting petitions calling for my immediate termination from Graybridge Biologics. Then came the direct threat. It arrived via a private message on a professional networking platform, sent directly from Laurel Pike. It was brief, arrogant, and dripping with barely concealed panic masked as friendly advice. "Daisy," the message read, "the public backlash is getting incredibly ugly. You have a very respectable corporate career to protect. It would be a terrible shame to see your professional reputation completely ruined over a messy divorce. If you just act sensibly, sign the operating agreements over, and release the liens quietly. Carson is willing to take the videos down and call off his mother. Let it go, for your own sake." They were thrashing wildly in the dark, hoping to land a lucky psychological strike. A normal person might have engaged. A normal person would have posted a furious rebuttal, drafted an angry public statement, or immediately called a lawyer to fire off a cease and desist letter. I did absolutely nothing of the sort. I did not engage. I did not argue a single point publicly. I simply sat at my desk, sipping black coffee, and opened a new master directory on my encrypted drive. I named it Defamation Ledger, with the cold, methodical precision of an archivist. I began to document their mistakes. I took high-resolution screenshots of every single social media post, every mass email, and every defamatory comment from their friends. I captured the video Carson posted, downloading the raw file to ensure he could not delete the evidence later when the tide turned. I saved Laurel's extortionate message. I was not building a defense. I was letting them dig a trench so deep they would never be able to climb out. They were handing me the ultimate gift. They were establishing a crystal clear, extensively documented pattern of malicious public defamation and targeted extortion to add to the impending federal charges. While they were busy fighting a phantom war on the internet, the actual foundation of their criminal enterprise finally shattered from the inside. It happened on Wednesday night. I was in my apartment reviewing compliance reports when my secure phone chimed with a massive incoming file transfer. The sender was Tessa Hale. There was no frantic text message this time. There was only a single, heavily encrypted compressed folder. I downloaded it and entered the decryption key I had provided her months ago for emergencies. The contents were devastating. The pressure of the impending legal collapse, combined with the sheer, undeniable toxicity of her family, had broken Tessa's loyalty completely. Inside the folder, I found the unfiltered truth. Tessa had included the original, unaltered email chains between Vivian and Reed Colton, explicitly discussing how to illegally shift the memorial funds to cover the overdue property taxes. There were raw, unedited invoice files that proved the floral consulting fees paid to Laurel were entirely fabricated. But the final, fatal piece of evidence was an audio file. I clicked play. The recording was grainy, captured secretly on a mobile phone from the hallway outside the main parlor at Halcyon House. I heard Carson's voice, speaking in an urgent, hushed tone to Laurel. "We just have to make it through the gala on Saturday," Carson whispered on the recording. "Reed says the bridge loan will clear the secondary accounts by Tuesday morning at the latest. As soon as the wire hits, we transfer 100% of the funds to the Charleston escrow account and we drive south. My mother can deal with the fallout here. She is the one who wanted the massive renovation anyway. It is her signature on the primary deed." "What about Tessa?" Laurel asked, her voice entirely devoid of sympathy or concern. "Tessa is the bookkeeper," Carson replied coldly. "She signed the ledger entries. If the state charity board comes looking for the missing funds, Reed will just point them at her. We will be 3 states away." Tessa had stood in the shadowed hallway and listened to her own brother casually plan to sacrifice her to federal investigators so he could buy a beachfront condominium with his mistress. That was the exact moment the Hale family loyalty died forever. She had immediately returned to her desk, bypassed Reed's security protocols, and extracted every single piece of raw metadata, every original file, and every unedited document before the lawyer could scrub them. She handed me the absolute, undeniable proof of their entire conspiracy. The next morning, I sat in the austere, glass-walled conference room of my private legal counsel. My attorney, a ruthless litigator who specialized in high-stakes corporate fraud, sat across the polished mahogany table. We spent 6 hours organizing the ammunition. We built 5 distinct, highly lethal legal packages. The first was the credit impersonation and wire fraud case, anchored by the Blue Ridge Merchant Capital server logs and the forged electronic signatures. The second was the insurance fraud file, complete with the manipulated photographs and false incident reports. The third was the defamation and extortion suit, built entirely from the digital smear campaign Vivian and Carson had so helpfully provided. The fourth was the charity fund embezzlement package, containing Tessa's raw ledgers and the backdated board resolutions. The final package was the formal civil complaint against Reed Colton for extreme legal malpractice, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. "We can file these injunctions right now, Daisy," my attorney said, tapping his gold pen against the stacks of paper. "We can have the local authorities at Halcyon House by 3 o'clock this afternoon. We can freeze every asset they have left and have them in a holding cell before dinner." I looked at the neatly arranged piles of destruction. It would be efficient. It would be clean. But it would be entirely private. They had spent the last 5 days dragging my name through the mud in front of the entire community. They had invited the public to watch my execution. "No," I replied softly, sliding the files back into my leather briefcase. "Do not file anything yet. Prepare the service packets. Coordinate with the state insurance investigators and the charity oversight board. I want everything synchronized perfectly." My attorney raised an eyebrow, understanding dawning on his face. "Synchronized for when they are throwing a party," I said, a slow, predatory smile finally touching the corners of my mouth. "And I believe it is terribly rude to ruin a celebration before the guests arrive." When I returned to my office, an express courier envelope was waiting on my desk. Inside was a formal, heavily embossed invitation to the Winter Lantern Gala, scheduled for the following Saturday evening. Attached to the invitation was a legal document drafted by Reed Colton, It was a comprehensive waiver and transfer of ownership agreement. A small handwritten note from Carson was clipped to the front. "Sign the transfer for a smooth ending," the note read. "Bring it to the gala. Let us just finish this so we can all move on." They truly believed they had won. They thought the relentless public pressure had crushed my resolve. They thought I was going to walk into their grand charity event, hand over my company, and quietly disappear into the night while they basked in the applause of their wealthy donors. I pulled a heavy cream-colored correspondence card from my desk drawer. I took my fountain pen and wrote a single, elegant sentence. "I have received your terms. I will see you at the gala." I sealed the envelope and handed it back to the courier. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. I was going to let them put on their formal wear, pour the expensive champagne, and invite every single prominent member of the community into their beautiful, fragile glass house. And then, I was going to turn on the lights and let the truth walk through the front door. By Thursday morning, Vivian had completely shifted her public relations strategy from open warfare to benevolent victory. She sent a polished, widely distributed email update to the top-tier donors of the Harbor Memorial Scholarship, a wealthy acquaintance of mine, who found Vivian's sudden pivot deeply suspicious, forwarded the message directly to my personal inbox. In the email, Vivian announced that the Winter Lantern Gala would not only celebrate a new chapter for the estate, but would also feature a special appearance by me. She deliberately framed my impending attendance as a gesture of healing and an amicable transition. She was meticulously spinning a narrative where she was the gracious, forgiving matriarch, generously welcoming the defeated, apologetic daughter-in-law back into the fold for one final, public surrender. Tessa, communicating through a secure messaging application, provided real-time updates from inside the belly of the beast. Carson was pacing the grand ballroom of Halcyon House, relentlessly practicing his keynote address. According to Tessa, he had drafted a deeply moving speech about liberation and authenticity. He planned to stand under the crystal chandeliers and regale the wealthy crowd with a story of a visionary entrepreneur who finally broke free from a marriage that was simply not on the same frequency. He was preparing to sell them the beautiful illusion of a man who had bravely chosen passion over cold, calculating control. Meanwhile, Reed Colton had formally delivered his masterpiece of legal extortion to my attorney. It was a 20-page settlement agreement disguised as a peace treaty. The terms were breathtaking in their sheer audacity. Reed wanted me to assume full liability for the commercial leases, waive my absolute right to pursue any future civil litigation regarding marital assets, and sign an ironclad non-disparagement clause. That specific clause carried a penalty of $500,000 if my actions or words ever negatively impacted the public standing of the memorial fund. It was a perfectly laid trap, functioning entirely on the assumption that I was desperate enough to sign away my financial life just to escape the public humiliation they had manufactured. And then there was Laurel Pike. She was buzzing around the ballroom, perfecting the ambiance of the evening. Tessa sent me a covert photograph of the setup. Laurel had ordered hundreds of expensive winter blooms, arranging them perfectly around a state-of-the-art audiovisual system. She had set up dual massive projection screens flanking the main stage, intending to display a highly produced slideshow of Carson's future architectural plans for the pub. She was meticulously constructing a beautiful, high-definition stage. She had no idea she was actually building the exact stage I needed to broadcast their destruction to the entire town, while they polished their crystal and rehearsed their lies. I spent my entire Friday inside a secure, glass-walled conference room in the financial district of Boston. I did not sit alone. I was flanked by my lead attorney, a senior fraud investigator from Blue Ridge Merchant Capital, the regional director of the Special Investigations Unit for Atlantic Standard Insurance, and a very quiet, very dangerous auditor from the State Charity Oversight Commission. We were not negotiating a settlement. We were orchestrating a synchronized legal strike. We spent 6 hours mapping out a minute-by-minute timeline for Saturday evening. I provided the gala's exact itinerary, which Vivian had so helpfully posted on the official website. Cocktail hour began at 7 o'clock. Dinner was served at 8 o'clock. The keynote speeches and the primary fundraising auction were scheduled for exactly 9 o'clock. That is the window, I told the room, pointing a silver pen at the printed schedule on the heavy mahogany table. At precisely 9:15, when Carson has finished his speech and the high-dollar pledges begin to process through the merchant terminals, we execute. The Blue Ridge investigator nodded, typing the timestamp into his secure terminal. I will cue the hard freeze on the gala's merchant account. Any credit cards swiped or entered into the online portal after 9:15 will automatically decline with a severe fraud code. The insurance investigator pulled a sealed, thick envelope from his briefcase. My team will be mixed in with the catering staff. The moment the auction stalls and the confusion peaks, we serve Vivian and Reed with the preservation of evidence mandates and the federal subpoenas. The state charity auditor did not smile. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at me. I have secured a warrant for the physical ledgers based on the data you provided. If what your source inside the house gave us is accurate, we will be taking the attorney into custody for evidence tampering right then and there. Everything was perfectly aligned. The snare they thought they had set for me was actually the very cage they were eagerly locking themselves inside. On Saturday afternoon, just 3 hours before the gala was set to begin, I sent one final, encrypted message to Tessa. I kept it brief, entirely devoid of any emotional reassurance. Attend the gala tonight. Dress appropriately. Bring the original, unaltered physical ledger for the memorial fund. And bring the master donor list. Keep them in a secure bag by your side at all times. Do not speak a single word of this to Reed, Carson, or your mother. If you warn them, I cannot save you from the federal indictments. I watched the digital Reed receipt appear on my screen. She did not reply, but I knew with absolute certainty she would comply. Fear is a far more reliable motivator than familial loyalty, especially when your family has already proven they view you as acceptable collateral damage. At 5 o'clock in the evening, I began to prepare myself. For 4 long years, I had attended Vivian's lavish events wearing muted, pastel tones, deliberately blending into the background so Carson could shine. I was always the quiet, sensible wife holding his coat while he worked the room. Tonight, I was not attending as a wife. I was attending as the director of a hostile takeover. I chose a perfectly tailored, midnight black tuxedo blazer with sharp, architectural shoulders, paired with a matching silk camisole and sleek, high-waisted trousers. I bypassed the delicate pearl earrings Vivian had forced upon me for our first anniversary, opting instead for a pair of sharp, geometric platinum studs. I pulled my hair back into a severe, flawless knot at the nape of my neck. I applied a deep, blood-red lipstick, a color Carson had always claimed was too aggressive for a woman in my supporting position. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back was not a broken victim of a cruel divorce. She was a weapon forged in the intense fires of corporate compliance, polished to a lethal, blinding edge. I checked my grandmother's heavy gold pocket watch. It was 6:30. It was time to go. I walked into my home office and picked up my briefcase. It was a slim, matte black leather portfolio. It did not contain lipstick or a compact mirror. It contained 3 perfectly organized manila envelopes. One held the forensic proof of the forged loan and the fake insurance claim. The second held the raw, unedited financial ledgers proving the systematic embezzlement of the charity funds. The third held the unsigned, utterly worthless settlement agreement Reed had drafted, ready to be returned directly to its arrogant author. I turned off the lights in my apartment. The silence of the city felt different tonight. It felt like the heavy, loaded silence that hangs in the air just before a massive thunderclap. I walked down the hallway to the elevator, the sharp click of my heels echoing against the marble floors. When I stepped out of the building and the valet handed me the keys to my sedan, I did not feel a single tremor of anxiety. I slid the black briefcase onto the passenger seat. As I pulled out into the Boston traffic and merged onto the highway heading north toward the coast, The reality of the evening settled over me like a heavy velvet cloak. I was not driving to a charity gala. I was not going to a party to make peace and surrender my assets. I was driving to a public execution, social, financial, and legal. They had built a beautiful, towering empire out of fragile glass and arrogant lies, and they had specifically invited me to stand in the very center of it. All I had to do was drop the hammer. The Winter Lantern Gala was a masterpiece of manufactured elegance, a breathtaking illusion constructed entirely on stolen foundation. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the grand ballroom of Halcyon House was completely transformed. Hundreds of flickering ivory candles cast a warm, golden, forgiving glow over the imported silk tablecloths and the massive crystal chandeliers suspended from the vaulted ceiling. A smooth jazz quartet played softly in the far corner, their sophisticated notes mingling with the bright, expensive sound of crystal champagne flutes clinking together. The air was thick with the scent of roasted winter root vegetables, expensive cedar wood smoke, and the heavy, intoxicating perfumes of the coastal elite. Prominent silver donor plaques gleamed under the strategic spotlighting, bearing the names of the wealthiest families in the county. It was beautiful. It was flawless. It was entirely fake. Vivian moved through the crowded room like the undisputed queen of the local aristocracy. She wore an emerald green velvet gown that swept gracefully across the polished hardwood floors. Her neck adorned with vintage diamonds she had undoubtedly purchased on credit. I watched her from the arched entryway for a long moment before making my presence known. She floated from table to table, touching the shoulders of wealthy patrons, throwing her head back in practiced, musical laughter, and absorbing their compliments like a dying plant absorbing water. She was entirely convinced that tonight was her grand resurrection. She believed she had successfully buried me in the court of public opinion, and she was currently taking her victory lap. I walked across the room, the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels barely masked by the upbeat jazz music. I navigated through the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns, keeping my gaze locked straight ahead. I reached the head table, positioned directly in the center of the room on a slight elevation. Carson sat there, radiating a sickening aura of triumphant arrogance. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that fit perfectly, his hair styled to project the image of a rugged, visionary entrepreneur. He patted the empty, high-backed chair next to him with a smug, condescending smile, treating me not as a formidable adversary, but as a final, tedious administrative chore he simply needed to complete before the real party could begin. Reed Colton sat on Carson's left, looking impeccably groomed and utterly predatory. As I sat down in the reserved chair, ensuring my posture was perfectly straight, Reed immediately slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the pristine white linen tablecloth. He leaned in, the cloying scent of his expensive cologne completely suffocating the smell of the roasted vegetables. "Sign it now, Daisy," Reed whispered, his voice smooth, low, and laced with absolute menace. "Sign the transfer right here, and everything dies in silence. You can walk out the back door right now. No one has to know, and we can all move on with our lives." I did not look at the document. I did not acknowledge his threat. I simply rested my hands on the table and looked out at the crowd. At 8:15, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom cracked open. Tessa slipped inside, and the temperature in the room seemed to subtly shift. She did not look like she belonged at a high society celebration. Her face was the color of wet ash. She wore a simple, unstructured dark dress, and both of her arms were wrapped incredibly tightly around an oversized, heavy canvas tote bag, holding it to her chest like a physical shield. Instead of taking her designated seat at the prominent family table near the front, she practically fled to a small, shadowy table near the kitchen exit, sitting entirely alone, her terrified. Erratic energy immediately bled into the surrounding space, introducing a sharp, dissonant chord of anxiety into an otherwise perfectly orchestrated symphony. The invisible cracks in their beautiful facade began to manifest precisely 10 minutes before the main speeches were scheduled to begin. I kept my eyes scanning the perimeter and watched Laurel Pike standing near the audiovisual control board at the side of the stage. She was wearing a stunning backless crimson gown, completely playing the role of the vital, indispensable event coordinator. Suddenly, her posture went completely rigid. She stared at the glowing screen of her mobile phone, her perfectly manicured thumb swiping frantically, tapping the screen with escalating aggression. A moment later, I saw a subtle, suppressed wave of panic ripple through the catering and event staff. A young waiter rushed over to the head of catering, whispering urgently while holding up a digital payment terminal. Laurel caught Carson's eye across the crowded room, giving a microscopic, terrified shake of her head. Her corporate credit card had just been violently declined by a secondary vendor, and the gala's main merchant account was beginning to seize up. Test transactions for the silent auction displays were hanging, the glowing screens turning from a welcoming blue to a severe, flashing red. Guests standing near the auction tables began to exchange confused, worried glances. The digital arteries of the event were being methodically clamped shut. The ambient anxiety was rising rapidly, palpable and electric. It was the exact right moment. I reached forward and picked up my crystal water glass and a heavy silver dessert spoon. I tapped the metal against the fragile crystal 3 times. The sharp, clear ringing sliced right through the jazz music, the clinking plates, and the nervous, escalating chatter. The room fell into an absolute, breathless silence within 5 seconds. Every face in the grand ballroom turned toward the head table. Carson looked at me, his smug smile faltering slightly, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his features. He had no idea what I was doing. I was going off his meticulously planned script. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my midnight black blazer. I looked out over the sea of faces. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." I projected my voice, keeping it perfectly calm, incredibly warm, and utterly commanding. Before we proceed to the main program and the keynote addresses, I wanted to take a brief moment to honor the true purpose of why we are all gathered in this beautiful room tonight. I paused, making direct, unbroken eye contact with the wealthiest, most prominent donors sitting in the front rows. "We are here to support the Harbor Memorial Scholarship," I continued, my voice ringing clear across the silent room. "We are here to generously give our resources to remember lost loved ones. We are here to ensure that the children of the commercial fishermen who died on those waters have a future built on honesty, integrity, and absolute transparency. The moral weight of your donations is the true foundation of Halcyon House, and it is vital that we honor the sanctity of those funds tonight." I let the heavy ethical significance of my words settle over the wealthy crowd. Vivian beamed from a table 10 feet away, mistakenly believing I was completely surrendering, delivering the heartfelt, submissive, brand-positive speech she had demanded. Carson let out a quiet, audible breath of relief, leaning back in his chair. I reached down to the floor and lifted my slim, black leather briefcase onto my lap. I unlatched the metal clasps. The sharp double click echoed loudly in the quiet space. I reached inside and withdrew 3 thick, heavy manila envelopes. I placed them deliberately, one by one, onto the center of the white tablecloth, dropping them directly on top of Reed Colton's unsigned settlement agreement. They landed with a heavy, final thud. I had used a thick black marker to write 3 distinct, highly legible titles across the front of each envelope. The first envelope read, "Loan Fraud." The second envelope read, "Donor Funds." The third envelope read, "Insurance Claim." I did not say another word. I simply sat back down, folded my hands in my lap, and looked at my husband. No one in the grand ballroom knew exactly what was inside those envelopes yet, but a visceral, collective chill ran down the spine of every person watching. Carson stared at the bold black letters, the color draining entirely from his face until he looked as pale as Tessa. Reed Colton completely stopped breathing, his hands frozen on the table. The beautiful, fragile glass house they had built was dead silent. waiting for the devastating impact of the truth. If we are going to finalize this settlement tonight, I believe in absolute transparency, I said, my voice cutting through the suffocating tension of the grand ballroom. I gestured toward the audiovisual booth, where Laurel Pike stood frozen in her crimson gown. Please mirror my laptop to the main projection screens. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward Carson, but the lead technician beside her had already hit the switch. The massive screens flanking the stage flickered to life. Instead of Carson's beautiful architectural renderings and branding mock-ups, a stark, clinical timeline appeared in bold white text against a black background. At 8:17 in the morning last Tuesday, my husband sent a text message permanently ending our marriage. I narrated, pointing to the giant timestamp projected on the wall. At 8:29 in the morning, exactly 12 minutes later, an emergency application for a commercial loan was submitted to Blue Ridge Merchant Capital from the private network of this very house. It contained my forged electronic signature and fabricated tax documents. Minutes after that, a fraudulent insurance claim was filed for a fictitious burst pipe. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. I hit a key on my laptop, and the screens immediately changed to display the hidden metadata of the submitted damage photographs, explicitly highlighting the capture dates from over 14 months ago, before anyone could recover from the shock. The catering staff, whom I had tipped incredibly generously hours prior, began placing a bound legal dossier on every single dinner table. In front of you is the true financial legacy of Halcyon House, I declared, my voice ringing with absolute authority. You will find bank records proving that the money you generously donated to the Harbor Memorial Scholarship never reached a single student. It paid the state property taxes. It covered the payroll for a failing pub. It bought rare scotch for my husband and paid fraudulent consulting invoices to his mistress, the very woman running the soundboard tonight. Tessa stood up from her isolated table in the back. Her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Every head turned. She was trembling violently, clutching her purse to her chest. But her voice carried across the silent room. "It is true," Tessa cried out, tears streaming down her pale face. "Reed Colton forced me to alter the transaction descriptions. He made me backdate the board meeting minutes to hide the theft. Carson and Laurel were going to take the loan money and run to Charleston. I am so sorry." Hearing the confession directly from the daughter of the house destroyed the last shred of Vivian's credibility. The room erupted into frantic, horrified whispers. Immediately, two men in tailored suits stood up from a table near the front. They were not wealthy donors. One was the lead investigator for the State Charity Commission, and the other represented Atlantic Standard Insurance. They walked directly to the head table, bypassing Carson entirely, and dropped thick stacks of legal mandates in front of Vivian and Reed. Preservation of evidence notices and federal subpoenas, the state investigator announced loudly enough for the front rows to hear. Simultaneously, a sharp, synchronized buzzing sound erupted from the electronic bidding tablets scattered across the room. The Blue Ridge Merchant Capital freeze had just taken effect. On the massive projection screens, the glowing totals for the silent auction violently refreshed. The numbers vanished, replaced by stark, flashing red banners reading "Merchant Account Suspended." The gala was instantly paralyzed. The heavy oak doors at the main entrance swung wide open. A uniformed civil deputy marched down the center aisle, holding a thick clipboard. "I am looking for the proprietor of Harbor and Ash," the deputy announced. He handed a legal notice to a completely paralyzed Carson. "Asset reclamation order. We are seizing the custom bar, the lighting fixtures, and the kitchen build-out, effective immediately, on behalf of Martin Harbor Holdings." Panic finally shattered Carson's arrogant facade. He looked at the deputy, then at the flashing red screens, and finally at the small, heavy lockbox containing the physical cash and check donations collected at the door. He lunged for it. He grabbed the heavy brass handle and sprinted toward the side exit leading to the kitchen. He burst through the swinging doors, but he did not make it to the parking lot. Two local police officers were waiting in the service corridor, dispatched on the felony identity theft and wire fraud complaints I had filed. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists before he could even drop the stolen box. Back in the ballroom, Vivian was losing her mind. She stood up, knocking her crystal champagne flute onto the floor. It shattered into a dozen pieces. "This is a lie," she screamed, her aristocratic poise entirely eradicated. "This is a malicious betrayal of our family." A man seated at the most prominent donor table slowly stood up. He was an elderly gentleman who had funded the largest wing of the local hospital. He looked at Vivian with absolute disgust. "My daughter died at sea 5 years ago," the man said, his voice shaking with a quiet, lethal fury. "Where did the money in her name go?" Vivian, that single question acted as a guillotine. The room fell into a dead, horrifying silence. Vivian opened her mouth, but no words came out. She collapsed back into her chair, realizing she was completely ruined in this town forever. Reed Colton was sweating profusely. He slid the settlement agreement back toward me, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the paper. "Daisy, please," Reed begged, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "We can negotiate this. We can work out a restitution plan." I looked over to the audiovisual booth. Laurel Pike had vanished, leaving her headset dangling on the soundboard. She had already fled through the loading dock. I stood up and picked up my black leather briefcase. I looked down at the expensive fountain pen Reed had placed on the table for me to sign away my life. I did not touch it. I turned to look at Carson, who was now being dragged back through the main doors by the police officers, his custom tuxedo wrinkled, his face a mask of utter humiliation. "You were wrong, Carson," I said, making sure my voice carried clearly to him. "That text message you sent me on Tuesday morning was not a weapon. It was the greatest gift of freedom anyone has ever given me. Enjoy your new life." I walked down the center aisle, the wealthy crowd parting for me in absolute, stunned silence. 6 months later, the coastal town looked very different. Carson was facing a brutal civil suit and a sprawling federal prosecution for wire fraud. Vivian was completely stripped of her board positions and lost Halcyon House to the banks in a messy, highly publicized foreclosure. Reed Colton was suspended pending a massive ethical investigation by the State Bar Association. Tessa, true to her word, had fully cooperated with the authorities and used what little she had left to start over quietly in a different state. As for me, I opened my own boutique risk consulting firm under my maiden name. I moved into a sunlit apartment with a massive balcony overlooking the ocean. The air there is clean, and for the first time in years, my life feels balanced. I learned that the most beautiful, devastating form of revenge is never screaming. It is simply turning on the lights, letting the truth walk into the room, and forcing every single person who underestimated you to sit in absolute silence. And that was the end of the Hale family's illusion. I did not need to destroy them. I only had to stop holding them up.